A mysterious maniac armed with an axe stalks and eliminates a family one by one on their remote farm. On a sunny morning, Alice waters the roses in the garden behind the house. Moments later, her husband Norman kisses her goodbye before leaving for his overnight trip to the city. Unbeknownst to the couple, a mysterious stalker hides in the bushes and secretly takes photos of them from afar. Eventually, Norman drives off in his car, and the stalker walks down a dirt path to a dilapidated trailer. Inside, he places the camera on the counter and then puts on a yellow raincoat and gloves. A person lies motionless on the bed next to him, and as he leaves, he grabs his camera and an axe. Meanwhile, Norman realizes he left something at the house, so he stops his truck to turn back. Minutes later, the stalker silently enters the house, and Alice, busy in the kitchen, is unaware of the intruder's presence. The man places his camera on the living room table before cutting the phone line with his knife. He then attacks the screaming woman with the weapon, ending her life. Soon, Norman returns home, but the only thing he sees in the kitchen is a solitary slipper on the floor and the hand mixer making a mess on the counter. Suddenly, the attacker appears and cuts his back with an axe. That night, Janet prepares dinner with her mother Nora and her sister Cindy. The older woman tells the younger daughter to call their cousins for dinner after she finishes setting the table. Janet comments that her mother still refuses to ask the men to help with household chores, so Nora says it's because she considers them women's work. Then, the mother asks Janet why she didn't bring her boyfriend Steve with her, especially since she thought she would finally meet him. Cindy teases, saying the couple had a fight, which the older sister denies, explaining that Steve couldn't come because he had to work. Nora insists, so Janet finally admits that she and her boyfriend had a fight because he wants to get married even though she insists she isn't ready. As they gather in the dining room, the sisters' cousins, Mark and Perry, and their grandfather Forrest Hodge sit at the table. The mother asks Cindy if her sister Paula has arrived yet, and she says no. Minutes later, they hear the doorbell, so Janet gets up to see who it is. To her surprise, Steve has made the trip to visit his family, and they share a kiss. The woman asks where his car is, so the boyfriend explains that it broke down several miles away, and he had to hitchhike to get there. Inside, Janet introduces Steve to everyone, and Nora comments that she is delighted he could come. Meanwhile, a man stumbles out of the trailer. At the same time, Cindy says that Steve looks more handsome in person than in the photos she has seen. When Nora mentions that her daughter told her he is a photographer, the boyfriend says that Janet gave him his first big break in the industry since she is an advertising executive. While the family enjoys their meal, a man stands outside the window watching. After dinner, they move to the living room where Cindy flirts with the photographer, to everyone's amusement. Cindy offers to wash the dishes and asks Nora if she would like her to prepare a plate for Paula. The mother says that the absent woman can fix it herself when she gets home, but Mark thinks she won't be home until much later because she's with her boyfriend George. Seconds later, Forrest asks Steve why he hasn't proposed yet, which leads Nora and the granddaughter to tell him to stop bothering the guest. The mother tells Steve that, even though he and Janet live together in the city, she would prefer them to sleep in separate rooms while they are at the house. After showing the boyfriend his room, she reiterates that he can't sneak into hers because they need to respect her mother's rules. Later, while Janet is showering, the stalker climbs up the trellis on the side of the house. Then, he photographs the unsuspecting woman through the window. Meanwhile, someone sneaks into Janet's room while she is still in the bathroom. As the woman gets dressed for bed, Steve comes out of the closet and throws her onto the bed, scaring her. She scolds the boyfriend for expecting them to sleep together after she had emphasized her mother's rules earlier. Steve says that he likes her family, but he mentions that her mother is always worried about Paula. Janet explains that her sister has always had a wild side and that she has an on-and-off relationship with George, her boyfriend, who lives in the trailer by the river. Eventually, Steve moves to get out of bed, but the woman tells him to stay and turns off the lamp. Minutes later, the boyfriend sneaks out of the bedroom, making sure no one is around. Meanwhile, in a dark room, the stalker reveals photos of a woman tied to a bed, Alice lying lifeless on the floor, and Hodge tending to his bushes. The next day, Janet finds her mother worried in the kitchen, who tells her that Paula didn't come home last night. Then, the daughter advises the woman to get some sleep while she and Steve look for Paula. Outside, Mark sees the grandfather working on his car, so the older man explains that the vehicle won't start and he can't figure out why. Then, Forrest mentions how strangely Mark has been acting lately, like disappearing for hours, and tells him to help around the house if he can. After breakfast, Janet asks Cindy to join them later since she knows where George's caravan is. Then, Steve asks Mark and Perry if they want to go with them, but the brothers say they have chores to do. Since George's caravan is by the river, Steve thinks it's a great idea to bring fishing rods with them so they can catch some fish. The couple heads to the basement to find the fishing rods, and at the bottom of the stairs, Steve sees a locked door and asks Janet where it leads. She says it's her father's darkroom, as his hobby was photography. Her boyfriend notices that she rarely talks about her father, so Janet reveals that he died in a fire along with her aunt and uncle, Mark and Perry's parents. No one knows what caused the fire, and after the tragic event, Nora took in her cousins to live with them. They continue searching for the fishing rods, and then Steve hears the woman scream in terror. When he asks what happened, she says she walked into a spider web. The man sees a small wooden door in the wall and wonders if the rods are there, but Janet says it's just a crawl space. Finally, they find the rods and a tackle box, then exit through a back door. While the couple waits for Cindy, Steve mentions how his house in the country seems like the perfect place to raise a family. Annoyed, Janet reminds him that he promised not to pressure her into getting married. However, Steve thinks he has given her more than enough time to think about it and says he can't wait for her forever. Suddenly, Cindy appears and realizes she interrupted the couple's argument. The man hands the rods to his girlfriend and says they should go on and that he will catch up with them. As the sisters walk down the dirt path, the stalker hides behind a tree and takes pictures of them. He then recalls a memory of a man taking pictures of a woman dressed in lingerie lying on a bed. As the pair crosses the forest, Steve suddenly jumps out of the trees to scare them. Cindy asks why he went back to the house and he says he had to return for his camera. Meanwhile, Officer Denton stops by the house to inform Nora and Forrest that their neighbors, Alice and Norman, have been reported missing. He has just come from their house and suspects foul play. The policeman asks if they have noticed anything strange in the area lately, and both say no. However, the older man apologizes and urgently runs toward the house. After he leaves, Nora mentions that Paula didn't come home last night, so Denton tells her not to worry because her daughter always comes home eventually. Just as the policeman leaves, Forrest tells Nora that Mark is not in the house, so he plans to go after Denton to tell him something that has been bothering him. The woman reminds him that his car doesn't work, so the man says he will use Janet's vehicle. Without the couple knowing, someone sneaks into the back seat just before Forrest gets into the car. During the ride, the killer plunges a knife through the seat, mortally wounding the older man. Then, he exits the vehicle and takes photos of Forrest's last moments. When the trio arrives just outside the RV, a man emerges from the bushes and starts attacking Steve. The women beg him to stop, and upon seeing the sisters, he flees. Steve and Nora wonder who it was, and Cindy says it was George, Paula's boyfriend. To their horror, they find Paula's lifeless body tied up on a bed inside the trailer, revealing that the woman tied up in the stalker's photos was the missing sister. They believe George killed Paula, so Steve says they need to go back to the house and call the police. Concurrently, the stalker steals a pair of Janet's underwear from her suitcase. At the house, they can't make a call because the phone doesn't work. Mark suggests going to Alice and Norman's house, but Steve says they already tried, but someone had cut their phone line. Since Janet's car was the only functioning vehicle on the property, they can't drive to town to get help. Steve theorizes that George killed Paula after she tried to break up with him, and Mark agrees that the man always seemed unstable. Suddenly, Nora appears and asks what happened, so Janet tells her that Paula died. The distressed woman faints and collapses on the floor, so they carry her to the bed. Steve offers to walk to town, but Mark says it's 20 miles away, so Janet tells her cousin to assemble his moped so he can use it to get help. So, she insists on returning to the trailer to cover Paula's body with a blanket. Steve and Cindy offer to accompany her while Perry stays with Nora, who is unconscious. Later, Officer Denton returns to the house, so Perry runs out to inform him of the situation. The officer asks the man to accompany him, but he says he can't leave his aunt and tells Denton to go to George's house by the river. In the trailer, Janet covers Paula's body with a blanket, then sees an empty film roll box on the floor. However, when she picks it up, Steve tells her to put it back to avoid disturbing the crime scene. Meanwhile, Denton stops his truck in the middle of the road and decides to walk the rest of the way. Suddenly, the stalker knocks him down with a 2x4, takes his gun, and shoots him. Outside the trailer, the trio hears the gunshot, so they follow the sound down the road. Finally, they find Denton's lifeless body and, Upon inspecting the police vehicle, Steve realizes that the killer shot the tires, disabled the engine, and destroyed the radio. Find the empty gun under the truck, so Janet tells him to grab the bullets from the policeman's belt. They return to the house to inform Perry that George killed Denton, and the cousin says their grandfather still hasn't returned. Moments later, Mark comes through the front door and the suspicious boyfriend asks where he's been. Mark says he was testing his bicycle, but Steve doesn't believe him. Cindy thinks the man suspects her cousin, so she reminds him that George is responsible for everything. Steve apologizes for his outburst and asks for the moped keys, but Mark insists on leaving. Before he leaves, Perry chases after his brother and begs him not to go, fearing the killer might attack him. However, Mark says he needs to go get help. As Mark drives down the road, George emerges from the trees and knocks him down, causing him to fall to the ground. Then, the unstable man grabs a large rock and holds it over Mark's head. However, seeing the terrified look on the injured man's face, he drops the rock and flees. When he realizes that the bike no longer works, Mark decides to walk the rest of the way. That night, George sits beside the bed in the trailer and cries over Paula's lifeless body. Meanwhile, Perry tells Steve and Janet that he saw someone outside watching them. So, the boyfriend tells the woman to take the gun and stay in the house while he and his cousin check outside. The men split up to check the junkyard, but moments later, Steve hears Perry screaming for help. However, when he reaches the spot where the fight happened, all he finds is the flashlight Perry dropped. He then sees a man running towards the house and follows him through the open back door leading to the basement. Steve sees that the door to the dark room is open and on the floor he finds a photo of Alice's lifeless body. Suddenly, the stalker appears behind him and knocks him unconscious with a blow to the head. Soon, worried Janet takes the gun to search for the two men and tells Cindy to lock the door. Minutes later, injured Perry knocks on the kitchen window and asks his cousin to let him in. The woman sees the cut on Perry's face, then the man says he's fine because he hit George with a flashlight, but he got away. Later, the man comforts the distraught Cindy on the couch. Then, he starts touching her inappropriately and tells her to kiss him. Disgusted and confused, the woman slaps him and walks away from the couch. Perry grabs the camera from the table and starts taking pictures of the terrified woman. He then reveals that he killed Paula because she allowed George to tie her up on the bed. He says it's just like what he saw when he was a kid. Cindy and Janet's father would tie his sister, Perry's mother, to the bed and take pictures, implying that the siblings were secretly having an affair. He admits that he set the fire that killed his mother and uncle, and that his father was collateral damage because he didn't know he was home. Perry corners Cindy by the wall and forces her to look at the before and after photos of all his victims. The woman manages to shake him off and runs to Nora's room. However, the man catches her and uses a telephone receiver to beat her to death. Meanwhile, Janet collides with a body and impulsively uses all the bullets on what she eventually realizes is George, who had hung himself from a pole. Concurrently, Perry wraps Cindy's body in a blanket and hides it in his room. He then prepares the rope at the four corners of his bed for his plan to tie up Janet and take photographs of her. When Janet returns home, she talks with her stunned mother who claims to have had a nightmare where she saw George beating Cindy repeatedly just meters from her bed. Nora shows her daughter the marks on her arm and says that Cindy grabbed her while pleading for help, but Janet believes she scratched herself. To reassure her mother, Janet looks for Cindy in Perry's room. She finds her underwear and an envelope with disturbing photographs in her cousin's bag. Hearing a noise, she hurriedly puts things back in the bag, but one photo falls to the floor. She then opens the closet and finds Cindy's body inside. Meanwhile, the deranged man pours gasoline all over the kitchen and barricades the front door. At the same time, Janet tells her mother that Perry has been the killer all along and they need to leave immediately. As they quietly descend the stairs, the disturbed man searches their bedroom, where he sees the photograph on the floor and realizes Janet knows he's the killer. The woman smells the gasoline and thinks Perry plans to set the house on fire, so she and Nora go into the basement. The mother stumbles and tumbles down the stairs, and as Janet checks the back door, it's locked from outside. Hearing Perry coming downstairs, she hides in the crawl space under the floor. Meanwhile, Mark returns with the police. In the basement, Janet finds Steve unconscious under a tarp, and as Perry crawls towards her, she grabs a wrench and strikes him. He staggers back and secures the woman in the crawl space with a screwdriver in the latch. Unbeknownst to him, Nora manages to crawl towards him and thrusts a pickaxe into his leg. However, the man retaliates by ending the life of the older woman with his axe. Eventually, Janet kicks open the door and chases the wounded man into the dark room. He manages to disarm her, but as he approaches wielding a wrench, the woman grabs scissors and stabs him in the stomach. Perry staggers toward the table, then Janet pushes his head into a container of water until he stops moving. Beneath the floor space, Steve regains consciousness and opens his eyes. Simultaneously, Perry appears behind Janet and menacingly approaches her with an axe. Suddenly, Steve climbs out from under the floor space, grabs a sharp metal rod, and impales the disturbed man. Later, as the traumatized survivors receive treatment in the ambulance, the crime scene photographer takes photos of Perry's lifeless body in the basement. If you liked the summary, don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. It's free and really helps me keep growing.